Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Fulco, Agnita Stine Schreiber Curator at the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts in Hagerstown, Maryland. And it's my pleasure to welcome you back to a new edition of the Curator's Den, a program in which we look at some of the very interesting stories behind works of art in the museum's collection. I thank you for joining me today, and we are going to resume where we left off last time, in which we examine the world of ukiyo-e prints from Japan during the 19th century. In particular, time span between about 1820 and 1900. Before we begin, I would just like to say a few words of thanks to First Energy Foundation on behalf of Potomac Edison for their support of this program. We very much appreciate it. Today, we're going to be looking at a group of ukiyo-e prints that expand upon what I discussed in my first video from last month. And if you haven't had a chance to explore that presentation, I strongly encourage you to do so. In that talk, I discuss the processes by which ukiyo-e prints were made, and I place them in their broad historical and cultural context. But for those of you who may not have had a chance to see that video, I will recap some of the main points that I made during that video. So today, as you can see from this slide, we're going to look at a broad spectrum of these ukiyo-e prints. And ukiyo-e, it translates from Japanese as pictures of the floating world. The techniques used in these prints, multiple colors, joining together of different scenes, actually picks up on a tradition of Japanese painting, which would have been done in pigments as well as ink, and oftentimes on scrolls. But it achieves these pictorial effects, these painterly effects, through the medium of woodblock prints. And that's what makes them really quite distinguished. Last time we talked about the cultural context of Japan. One for many centuries, it was ruled by different samurai or warriors, part of different clans that were fighting each other throughout the Japanese island and islands. For example, at Kamakura in Tokyo, Sendai, Kyoto, and Osaka are others. All of these different clans were warring with one another. And we discussed the context of this, particularly the Tokugawa shogunate that we're going to be looking at today, with the Emperor Tokugawa Ieyasu. So keep this in mind as we're going through today, that Japan in the 19th century is at a crossroads. It's going to be transitioning from a period of feudal society that is governed by these samurai warriors to one in which the emperor is going to reclaim a lot of power. And this hadn't happened for quite some time in Japanese history. So the period that we're looking at is the late Edo, which is roughly 1606 to 1868. And then after the Edo comes the Meiji dynasty, in which the emperor reemerges as the dominant figure, one of them in politics, from 1868 all the way through the 1900s. Last time we looked at very interesting battle print by the artist Utagawa Yoshikazu. We also looked at artists such as Utagawa Kunisada and Kuniyoshi, kabuki figures, as well as literary narratives, stories from the past. In this case, the Flower Palace that we discussed last time. And in addition, this very dramatic battle scene of the Battle of Mamishibashi, in which the Taira clan, going all the way back to the year 1180, would defeat the Minamoto in a fierce battle, as you can see that's dramatically depicted here. But what will result is, this was during the Genpei War of the 1180s, much earlier period in Japanese history. Ultimately, the Minamoto family is going to win. So I certainly encourage you to see that video in Japanese theater with kabuki figures, to which we will return today. So we talked last time about Yoshikazu and the Great Battle of Mamishibashi. This is something that's called an Oban triptych print, in which you have three different pieces of paper that are joined together to make one larger composition. You're going to see that format used quite a bit. What was really interesting was that Yoshikazu, and we'll be talking about him a bit later on, was really adept at this technique, and he learned it from his teacher, Utagawa Kuniyoshi. And this is the Great Battle of Mamishibashi, although a very different rendition. One that is, if you will, less densely populated with figures and focuses more on these vignettes or isolated scenes. This draws upon a tradition of medieval Japanese art, going all the way back to the late 13th century, for example. The Kamakura period, with, as I discussed last time, a section of a large scroll in the Museum of Fine Arts of Boston, section on the night attack of Sanjo Palace. These elements that you see in Japanese painting, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, were picked up on by ukiyo-e print artists. And this was very important in the development of their pictorial style. So one thing to keep in mind is that the ukiyo-e prints are widely distributed to different audiences, both common people and aristocrats alike, beginning in the late 18th century with artists like Utagawa Toyoharu. We looked at this one last time. And I explored how actually the use of linear perspective, as well as the arrangements of figures, the increase in paying attention to human anatomy, these elements are drawn from 18th century European prints, and they help to shape and influence the development of Japanese printmaking in the 18th century. That will lead to the sort of definitive style of ukiyo-e that we're going to be looking at in further depth today. But artists like Toyoharu were in possession of 18th century Italian prints, such as this one on the right by Michele Marieschi in our collection, of the compound church of Santi Giovanni Paolo in Venice. These were traded on the market and were imported to Japan. You want to keep this in mind because I'm going to be talking about cultural and artistic exchange today as I go through the presentation. Contacts between Japan and the West. That worked the other way as well, whereby Japanese art, by the time we get to the later 19th century, particularly in the Meiji period, we have the emergence of something called Japonism, which I discussed last time. That is a craze for Japanese art in all of its forms, textiles, sculpture, decorative arts, painting, and particularly prints. And you can see how the artist James Tissot in this painting is trying to show this. These ladies are absolutely fascinated by Japanese art and culture. And look at all of these decorative elements that are pulled into the composition. It's just really a wonderful painting. We see it also pervade the graphic arts with this cover from Paris Illustrated Magazine, May 1886, in which the Japanese prints created, for example, in this case, Keisai Eisen is being incorporated into French graphic design at the time, commercial design, and artists like Vincent van Gogh, who go so far as to actually copy Japanese prints and make their own composition. That's how taken he was with it. And one of the most important artists working in these ukiyo-e traditions is the very famous Shika Hokusai, commonly just referred to as Hokusai, who's one of the most famous Japanese artists who ever lived. And his image here that you're looking at, the Great Wave, is from his series of 36 views of Mount Fuji, one of the most famous mountains in Asia, and certainly in Japan. And this is that Great Wave off of Kanagawa, central Japan. And what this does is it speaks to the power of nature over humans. You can see that the boat on the left is being engulfed by this enormous wave, which almost seems to be as big as the mountain itself, although the perspective here is deliberately manipulated by the artist to make us think that. So Hokusai was really great at creating these textures and creating coloristic contrast. And now we come to a work by Hokusai that's in the collection here at the museum called Sawyers Cutting Lumber, from another one of these sets of series that he produced. This one, 100 Poems Explained by a Nurse or a Wet Nurse, with the Japanese title there. Before I go into a little bit more discussion of this print, I just want to point out that Hokusai is really such an important artist because what he does is he transforms ukiyo-e from a style of portraiture largely focused on courtesans and actors, as we looked at with Kabuki, into a style of art that focused on landscapes, plants and animals, and very importantly, scenes of daily life. And that's what we see here with Sawyers Cutting Lumber. And this was based upon this image and the others in the series, groups of poems that praise aspects of Japanese culture. And in this instance, we've got lumber workers who are cutting wood. They're preparing it for use in construction. And this is a critical part of Japanese society if you've studied Japanese architecture before, yes, there were solid masonry buildings, but many temples, shrines, civic structures are still to this day constructed out of wood. And this is a tradition in Japanese architecture, whereby anytime the wood decays, the structure, particularly a temple, is rebuilt. It's part of an ongoing process of historic preservation. So that ties in very importantly here with this print. This is showing a passion for, a love for this woodworking industry that makes Japan run and continue to operate. Here you can see the workers manipulating these saws. Another one here in the foreground, he's pulling at a log, he's going to bring it in. And then you also have trees in the background, which refer to the felling of them as an activity. Hokusai is very adept at creating coloristic contrasts in using multiple colors and applying them to these wood blocks, which were oftentimes made of cherry wood, from which, of course, a print would be pulled from the press. Here are a couple of others to place the one that we have in our collection in context. A poem by a poet named Ise, and a poem by a Japanese emperor named Tenchi, which goes back quite some time to the medieval period in Japan, feudal period. And the one on the left shows roof workers. These are scenes of daily life. They're placing tiles on the roof here, while in the background, rice farmers gather their crops. And the reflection, the sky here against the water, the ripples on the water is just really stunning. And you can see how the fields extend into the distance. Artists like Hokusai, they're really very interested in capturing these different layers or recession in space drawn from a Western perspective that I showed you at the beginning. And you can see that working really well here in the one on the right, which shows, again, rice workers diligently going about their duties. And look at the multiple colors achieved throughout the print, almost as if it were a painting. It's very painterly, Hokusai style. And the print on the right originates from a poem in which the emperor was traveling through the countryside. The weather became bad, and he is given lodgings by these peasants whose hard work and simple way of life he greatly admires, and he writes about in this poem. And you can see that sort of compassion, that sympathy for the condition of the peasant worker, the reference to the houses near to which the emperor stayed in the background of the composition. Continuing on, we have another very important artist named Ando Hiroshige, also known as Ukiyo-e. He is, in some regards, as famous as Hokusai and for his creating of these different series of prints, including landscapes, the 53 stations of the Tokaido, and 100 famous views of Edo. And also the series that we're looking at here, we have one in our collection. This one is a view of Maruyama. And these different kinds of views show the strong influence that Hokusai exerted on Hiroshige, particularly his choice of subjects, but also coloristic contrast, juxtaposition. The use of blues, oranges, whites, and yellows to heighten the overall composition. However, some argue that Hiroshige's approach was more poetic and ambient than Hokusai's bolder, more formal prints. And we can see that to some regard in these. The subtle use of color in those gradations was essential to Hiroshige's work. And he employed a technique called the Bokush, color gradation. And you can see how that's working here in the foreground as we go from bluish green to these uses of yellows and golds, all the way to the oranges and whites and the blues towards the top of the composition in the sky. This is really a signature aspect of Hiroshige's work. And this is really fascinating because it provides us a window onto a very important district in the port city of Nagasaki during the mid-19th century. This was the main entertainment area of town for bars and restaurants, and also for different kinds of places for socializing. And that's what we see here is we see a corner, a window onto that way of life. Two women dressed in these elaborate kimonos. One of them has a spyglass. She's looking out, very likely onto the harbor, and you have the tree that sort of anchors the composition on the lower left. Just a lovely print. And look at how the coloring of the railing of the building itself picks up on the chop or cartouche that we see up here. Very carefully done by Hokusai. And then also the square, I'll get to that after in the next set of prints, picks up on the motifs down here. So we have a view onto contemporary fashion, interior design, and landscape. It's all combined into one print. Really brings it to life. Hiroshige would do a number of these prints, and I'm showing you a selection of them. Here's Spectacles Bridge, also in Nagasaki, and a harbor containing Chinese ships of Nagasaki Harbor. The Spectacles Bridge is identified by the cartouche or plaque here, and then different mountains are identified by these chops or cartouches. This cartouche tells us the series. The square tells us the exact subject that we're looking at, in this case, the bridge. And again, we have these layered perspectives. The bridge in the foreground receding into the distance with the mountains, and then the people who are making their way over the bridge. A Chinese trading ship in the harbor here, wind blowing against its sails as well as its flags. And then you can see how the compositional elements, particularly the sky, the attention to detail, decorative especially, correspond to the other view that we have in our collection over here on the right. How do we know it's by Hokusai? Excuse me, how do we know it's by Hiroshige? We have down here the signature, which also in many cases alerts us to the publisher. Very important in identifying the prints. Now, as time goes on in the mid-19th century, Japan's going to undergo a number of changes. And that is especially important with the context between East and West. An important figure in this is Commodore Matthew Perry, American naval officer, who makes a very important journey to Japan in 1853 with the aim of opening the country up to trade and also to American interests. And this is print that I'm showing you here from the Meiji period, from 1889, shows the arrival of American ships. And in the foreground, we have Japanese feudal retainers who are interacting with one another and responding to the arrival of these different boats, in this case, American steamships coming into harbor, signaling a change, and in particular, exchange and encounters between East and West. This will continue once Commodore Perry returns again in 1854, when he negotiates and by force makes the Japanese Tokugawa shogunate sign the Kanagawa Treaty. And that's what these prints show here. Is Commodore Perry being led here into a tent, to a pavilion, and for the preliminary discussions and negotiations, which are going to actually lead to the signing of the treaty. Here, the American officials are seated opposite the Japanese ministers. In a government building, note also the incorporation of a painted screen as a means of depicting the actual context in which these proceedings occurred. The purpose of Commodore Perry's trip was to get Japan to abandon its 220-year-old policy of seclusion, which was known as sakoku, which was basically involving only very limited trade with certain merchants, and particularly Dutch and Portuguese. But what Commodore Perry wants to do is open it up to American contact, and also ensuring the safety of American castaways and establishing the position of an American consul in Japan to promote United States interests. And keep that in mind in terms of Commodore Perry's various efforts, because that's going to have an effect on artistic production and specifically ukiyo-e. We return to that artist we started with, Utagawa Yoshikazu. And here we have a foreign residence in Yokohama. And this is one of the cities to which foreigners are going to flock beginning in the mid-19th century. This print really shows it very well. And Yoshikazu is most famous for his Yokohama-e, or pictures of Yokohama, in which he depicts different Europeans, Americans, and other Westerners who are shown here having a meal together in one of their own private homes and going about their daily business. And this is very interesting to observe. Here's a guy in the background getting his hair cut. The family enjoying the meal here. This guy's playing the cello. And then you can see the ships in the background. So you have it all going on in the composition of domestic space, that of mercantile activities of commerce out in the background. Note the inclusion of Japanese people, and they're interacting with Westerners. So this is Japan at the cusp of change. Further interaction. And here we come to two prints that are in our own collection by Yoshikazu, of foreign officials going around town. And this is very likely in Yokohama. Outside a traditional Japanese building, note in the background again that reference to shipping and the arrival of these individuals by sea. This is how they got there. They are depicted as to the best ability of the artist based upon careful observation and making sketches. But we also need to keep in mind that Yoshikazu and other Japanese artists had not really had extensive contact with Europeans or Americans until this point. So he's still learning how to depict these people. He does this similarly with the US Marines in Yokohama print, which is particularly interesting, using again the color, very much affected by the style of both Hiroshige and Hokusai, so that the entire motif is picked up on. Note also that the Japanese are starting to, in the late Tokugawa shogunate, they are starting to pick up on the use of Western architecture, and that's being shown here. But the main point of the print is to depict the presence of the American Navy in Japan at the time, in Yokohama. This is the beginning of what will become an official diplomatic relationship between the United States and Japan. Now, at the same time that we see contemporary events and happenings occurred, artists still reach back to the past. And we really see that with the artist Utagawa Kunisada, who here depicts a work titled Dust in View of the Sea in Edaguchi, which is actually one story. But if we translate the text throughout the print, we find out that he's actually combined it with a very old tale, one of which you probably heard. It's called The Tale of Genji, which is often referred to as the world's first novel, dating from the 10th century and authored by Murasaki Shikibu. And this is a very famous story that tells the loves of the Shining Prince Genji. So the Shining Prince Genji story is basically merged into one composition there. And it's merged with another story about a priest who comes to specifically Eguchi to seek contact with a bodhisattva, which according to his account, while visiting the inn, he looked at a courtesan through a jewel, whereupon he realized that that woman, that courtesan, is a manifestation of the bodhisattva named Fugen in Japanese. So the reference to the place is made by the sailboats here in the harbor, the house, the building in the background, and the figures here. Here's the gentleman who's seated here, and then you have the courtesan. A meal laid out here, literally a feast for the eyes. And then also, look at the wonderful and loving depiction of the kimonos that pick up on the coloristic motifs throughout the composition, including the boats, as well as these cartouches, the woman who's fishing on the left. And again, the use of the balustrade, the railing. So Kunisada was very adept at using the Oban triptych format of the prints to pull the entire composition together. He's leading our eye from the foreground all the way into the distance and clearly responding to Western techniques of perspective. But Kunisada also was a master and very well known for his depiction of Kabuki actors. And the Kabuki theater, just to refresh our memories, involves dancing and acting multiple roles in which actors would change the particular character very quickly. So on the left, you have one actor, in this case, Onoe Kikosuke, at least we believe that's who it is. And then on the right, he's playing the role of this character. And then on the right, you have another actor playing three roles. So this is very interesting, including a woman. This speaks to the diversity of the different kinds of characters in the Kabuki theater, which was known as the quick change technique of the characters, Hayagawari. And this was a very important aspect of Kabuki. Kuniyoshi, as well as the artist Kunisada, are known for their use of coloristic variety. And very interestingly, in terms of the Kabuki actors, you have a wide range. Here you have the play itself called Oji, and then the actor as this particular character from one of the series of 36 fashionable restaurants of the Eastern capital. So theater is merged with daily activities of dining as a means of promoting the actor's reputation and commercially also promoting the interests of the restaurant. So this is very interesting to observe. And then on the right, we have a different kind of print in which we have an actor playing another one of these roles in the play of Mibu no Tadamine from the witty matchings of 36 poets. But in this case, those poets are compared to Kabuki actors. So it's as if the actors themselves playing these roles are as great as, or as capable as those poets from much earlier in Japan's history, going back actually in this case to the Heian period, which would be really feudal Japan, medieval Japan. So it's quite interesting. And as you can see, it's paired with these beautiful cherry blossoms that are in the background, the landscape elements. And Kabuki actors were known for having their faces painted very elaborately, also other their arms and other body parts, and wearing masks. So it's a very elaborate art form in Japan. Now, as time moves on, once we transition to the Meiji dynasty, the emperor is going to reemerge as the central force of power, and Japan will again be called an empire. So the samurai, in this case, are no longer in power. It's concentrated in the emperor and his cabinet, particularly his generals. And Japan at this time is changing rapidly. What we saw beginning with Commodore Perry in the 1850s is going to accelerate once the Meiji emperor ascends to power. In 1868, Japan is going to embark on rapid industrialization. And you can see here the smokestacks in the background of this print. That's one aspect of it, that Japan's going to modernize, but also it's going to begin, according to his rule, to the adoption of latest Western European and American fashions, including the use of Western military uniforms. But look at how it's presented within the traditional elements of the Oban triptych format of the print. So it's a merging of traditional Japanese artistic forms and culture with something new, something modern. And you'll note that the industrialization is encroaching upon the traditional life of Japan, traditional landscape. We have some prints that are really depictions of quite the opposite of what we saw in the previous print, and that's because this artist, Toyohara Chikanobu, was very versatile. He depicted contemporary subjects such as the emperor we saw before with his family, and here his hanging scrolls print from ceremonies and manners of ladies. This is a print that serves to reinforce gender roles among Japanese women that go back centuries. So you have this syncretism and this coexistence of traditional and contemporary forms at this time in Japanese society. And as we saw in some of the other prints today, particularly the triptychs, it's a very important aspect of Japanese art, the creation of scrolls. And it shows them preparing, these women, preparing them to hang them. And they're dressed in elaborate kimonos. And then over on the right, this courtesan prepares to serve tea and a meal to these ladies. This harkens back to a tradition that we saw in the previous presentation of the late 18th century with Kitagawa Utamaro, when we looked at this print on how the prints themselves are made. But you see where it's coming from and that it hangs on, it continues all the way down through 1898 to 1900, much later in the empire. And this one, geishas or courtesans arranging flowers. This one is likely part of the same series that we saw before that's also in our collection of ceremonies and manners of ladies. And in this instance, they are arranging and getting flowers ready for display. The artist using a very similar technique in both instances. So at the same time that Chikanobu, who's one of the most famous printmakers of the later Meiji dynasty, at the same time, he also is depicting those contemporary events. So he's very diverse in the offerings he had. Here we have a scene in the Japanese Diet. That's another word for the Japanese parliament. And you can see how they've adopted Western fashion. The men are wearing the suits, the women these very large dresses. Even the dais, this canopy, that's shown up above as the Japanese officials meet to conduct government business. And then at the time as Japan expands its power through military force, we see a battle scene from the First Sino-Japanese War, or battle between the Chinese Empire, late Qing dynasty, and the Meiji Empire. Shown here on the right, a very dramatic scene. However, it is updated, the Oban triptych format, to suit this contemporary context. So I thank you for joining me today on our journey through ukiyo-e prints and Japanese art of the 19th century, and I invite you to come along next time as I have a discussion with you about American art from the collection of the 19th century. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care for now. Bye.